Welcome to the second of the short videos that we're producing here at the Liverpool Law School to help inform our fellow citizens and stakeholders about some of the key issues which are arising from the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. And this video addresses the question, what is the single market? Or if you like, the common market or the internal market. The terminology doesn't really matter very much. And this question is important really for two main reasons. First of all, the single market is absolutely central to the debate about the UK's future in Europe. It was central before the referendum and it continues to be central since the referendum. For many people, actually, membership of the single market is the key, if not the overriding issue, which should dominate the UK's negotiating strategy as we move forward. While other people dismiss the single market as somehow nothing more than an empty slogan, or say that it's effectively interchangeable with other trade relationships such as the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The second reason, however, is that it's very, very clear that most of the people who speak so confidently about the single market in these terms really don't have very much of an idea about what the single market actually is, how it actually operates. And it's really difficult, I suppose, to fathom how a concept which is so central to the debate about our national future can be subject to so much inaccurate and even misleading discourse by politicians and by certain sections of the media. Even now, many politicians and journalists talk about the single market in terms which are completely obsessed by tariffs, when actually tariffs are probably one of the least important parts of the single market. Or they describe international trade relations in terms of vindictiveness and punishment, when actually that distorts the simple, inherent and intractable problems that are posed by international trade and tries to convert them into some sort of moral contest. So this video is aimed to try and help our fellow citizens cut through some of this unhelpful language, to understand what the single market actually is, how it operates, and hopefully thereby be able to bring a more critical scrutiny to bear upon some of the debate that we hear in the media. Now let's begin by putting tariffs in their proper place. Tariffs are basically frontier taxes. If you want to bring your goods into my country to sell them, you have to pay me some money. They artificially raise the cost of an imported product, they make it less competitive on the domestic market, and they're undoubtedly important for importers and for consumers because they do distort international trade, albeit often for sound policy reasons. Very often, countries are simply trying to limit the damaging effects that full open trade might have upon their own domestic industries. But tariffs are also relatively easy. They're easy to spot and they're easy to deal with. Either you have tariffs or you don't. And if you do have tariffs, you decide which level you're going to pitch them at for different categories of good. But just as importantly, for countries which are members of the World Trade Organization, their discretion over their own tariff systems is limited by their obligations under the WTO. After all, if you're a member of the WTO, you're obliged to apply the same tariff system to all other members of the WTO, save in certain circumstances, in particular where countries have agreed a special preferential trade relationship between themselves, for example, the EU Customs Union. But for all the political and media obsession with tariffs, they're certainly not the most important or the most difficult problem in international trade. The real problems in international trade come from non-tariff or regulatory barriers. Now, these are barriers which arise simply through the differences which exist between national legal systems, which then create difficulties for people who want to engage in cross-border commerce. For example, let's say that I manufacture toys in my own country, and I follow my own country's rules on the safety of toy components, on the acceptable packaging, on appropriate labelling. But when I want to sell my toys in another country, that country says, well, you have to meet all of our slightly different standards on components, on packaging, on labelling. And not just that country, but 28 different set of slightly different rules on components and so on and so forth. And I'm therefore faced with a choice as a producer. Either I have multiple production lines to meet the different regulatory standards of different countries, which will obviously raise my costs and therefore my prices and reduce my competitiveness, or more likely I simply won't bother at all. I'll simply stay within my own national market and meet my own national rules. Now, in that type of situation, international trade isn't being held back by something as easy as tariffs. It's being held back by the simple and inevitable fact that different countries have different rules, and those different rules naturally partition national markets and make it more difficult to engage in cross-border commerce. Now, these regulatory barriers are absolutely commonplace and they're completely disruptive, but they're also very difficult to deal with because unlike tariffs, you can't just decide that you're going to have regulation or not have regulation. We all need to have regulation that protects the environment, workers, consumers, the public interest, and so on. And it's simply inherent in the existence of that regulation that we have cross-border trade obstacles. It's not protectionist, it's not vindictive, it's not some sort of moral confrontation, it's simply inevitable and inherent. And it's very difficult to deal with. Now that's where the single market comes in, because what makes the single market so advanced, so integrated, and unlike any other trade deal on earth, is that the EU has taken on this task of trying to reduce and eliminate these regulatory barriers to trade. Now, it took quite a while for the EU to develop an effective strategy by which to do so, but that strategy can be summarised in two main concepts: limited harmonisation, followed by mutual recognition. And I'll just say a little more about each of those. Limited harmonisation is the process whereby the member states identify what we call the essential public interest requirements that they want to protect in any given sector. What makes toys safe? What makes financial services reliable? And having identified those essential public interests, they try to agree a common set of principles which will govern those public interests across every member state. And they harmonise their national rules on those specific issues. They adopt common standards across every country. Now that limited harmonisation then paves the way for mutual recognition, our second concept. Provided goods or services have been lawfully manufactured or provided in their home country, meeting the agreed common standards, those goods and services can be sold and provided in every other country within the single market without any further obstacles, without any further regulation, and even though they don't meet all of the other non-harmonised parts of that member state's legal regime. Now, this model of limited harmonisation, which then paves the way for mutual recognition between the member states, is essentially a methodology. It's a template which can be used almost regardless of the economic sector in question. And once you understand the methodology of the single market, limited harmonisation, then mutual recognition, you effectively understand almost every field of single market law, because the same technique is used when it comes to dealing with barriers caused by environmental regulations or consumer rights, as is used in fields like banking services or insurance services. Now, crucially, the operation of this entire system relies upon a very high degree of mutual trust and mutual cooperation between the member states. They have to trust each other that they'll allow each other's goods and services to flow freely between their territories without causing further obstacles. And one of the most important basic functions of the EU institutions is to create, to promote, to maintain that sense of mutual trust between the member states that keeps the single market functioning. So, for example, at the legislative level, in order to adopt common harmonised rules, you need a legislative body which is capable of acting with a degree of efficiency, effectiveness and democratic accountability. That's what the Council and the European Parliament are there for. On an administrative level, the single market needs independent bodies and systems that will ensure that the common rules are being properly implemented and enforced across the member states, and there will also grow strong networks of national and European agencies to monitor the operation of the system, to identify problems, to react with appropriate solutions. On the judicial level, the single market needs an independent and impartial court that will interpret the rules uniformly for all of the member states and enforce them without grace or favour. And one final point to stress about the internal market, something that we raised in our previous video about the UK legal system. The internal market is based on the principle of competition that's not just free, it's also fair. So the member states should not compete with each other on the basis of simply axing basic regulatory standards which are there to protect the environment, workers, consumers, and so on. And so not only does the single market involve limited harmonisation and mutual recognition when it comes to economic activity, it also involves minimum standards for basic social and welfare protection so as to prevent the member states from engaging in unfair competition. Now, it's taken the EU 50 odd years to develop this system of mutual trust to the point that we've reached today. On the one hand, anyone who claims that the single market is just a slogan or it has no real meaning clearly knows zero about the internal market. On the other hand, the internal market is not an end state. It's not a final project. The internal market is effectively a continuous process. There's no such thing as completing or finishing the internal market. It's about managing trade barriers, reducing and eliminating them. Because every time that consumer behaviour changes, every time that a new technology emerges, every time that scientific advances throw up new problems, there is the potential for new barriers to trade, which then have to be negotiated into limited harmonisation to pave the way for new waves of mutual recognition. So much for the single market. By contrast, other forms of trade relationship simply lack the institutions, they lack the structures, the capacity, and indeed the will to deliver anywhere near the same degree of market integration. There's little harmonisation, if any. There's little mutual recognition, if any. There's precious little mutual trust and insufficient institutions or procedures that would actually be capable of generating it. And as a result, most trade relationships focus on easy things like tariffs. If they tackle regulatory barriers at all, they tend to do so by outlawing discrimination against foreign goods or services, or maybe recognise a limited degree of regulatory equivalence, or maybe provide for limited forms of administrative cooperation. And that's true of the vast majority of bilateral trade relationships on Earth, and it's also true of institutions such as the World Trade Organization. Now, all of that is why being in the single market is considered so important to its members. It's also why gaining full access to the single market, if you're not a member state of the European Union, is such an extensive commitment. And we see that in the case of the European Economic Area Agreement involving Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland. And it also explains why being outside the single market, or the EEA, makes it so difficult to replicate any comparable degree of close trading relationships, either with the single market or indeed with anybody else. Now, to reiterate, these problems are not about protectionism, these problems are not about vindictiveness by the European Union or by anyone else. Regulatory barriers are simply an inherent feature of the world economy, and it's the unique achievement of the single market that the member states have sought and in many cases succeeded in overcoming them. And so what makes so much of the UK debate about the single market so inaccurate and so misleading isn't just the sort of narrow obsession with tariffs or the inappropriate attempt to turn international trade into some sort of moral confrontation. Above all, perhaps, it's the failure to grasp that signing up to any international trade commitment involves taking on quite extensive and significant commitments which have a very tangible and potentially penetrating effect upon your own national regulatory autonomy. And in particular, being a member or a beneficiary of an advanced trade relationship such as the single market, or even having privileged access to an advanced trading relationship such as the single market, means signing up to an entire package of institutions, of frameworks, of rules, of procedures that make the whole system function at all. And so politicians may well talk about having their cake and eating it. They may well talk about being a member of the single market without giving up national autonomy. They may promise manufacturers and service providers full access to the single market while cherry picking the bits that they want and rejecting the bits that they don't. They can even fantasize, I suppose, about having a better trade relationship with the single market than they do as full members of the European Union. But really, I think there's two explanations for that type of discourse. Either it reveals a really worrying failure to grasp certain basic principles of international trade in general and the single market in particular, or, more worryingly, it might be an attempt to deliberately create a narrative whereby the UK is somehow making reasonable demands and the European Union is somehow deliberately thwarting the UK's wishes so as to try and thrust the blame of inevitable failure to secure a better deal onto the awful foreigners. Either way, if the UK tumbles out of the single market, either falling back upon an ordinary garden variety bilateral trade deal, or worse still, back onto the baseline rules of the WTO, there is no doubt whatsoever, none whatsoever, that large sectors of the UK economy in manufacturing and in financial services, for example, will have to adjust to a new and significantly less favourable regulatory environment when it comes to the conduct of international trade.